Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here to, dive deep into some really fascinating and important topics. Today we're going to be tackling something that's, it's pretty crucial in the whole climate change discussion. We're talking about solar geoengineering and specifically how people, especially here in the U.S., are thinking about it, are feeling about it, the whole public perception thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, climate action is such a hot topic these days, right? You hear about it constantly. And there's so many different potential solutions being thrown around. And solar geoengineering, well, it's definitely one that's gaining traction, even though, to be honest, I think a lot of people are still trying to wrap their heads around it.
For sure. And to help us really understand what's going on here, you shared a super interesting research paper with me. It's called, let me get it right, Partisanship Overcomes Framing in Shaping Solar Geoengineering Perceptions. Evidence from a Conjoint Experiment. Quite a mouthful, but really insightful.
It is. It is.
And what we're going to try to do in this deep dive is really pull out the golden nuggets from this study, right?
Right.
See what it tells us about what really shapes public opinion on this pretty complex technology.
Yes.
Is it more about how you talk about solar geoengineering, or is it more about who's actually doing the talking?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's all about kind of peeling back the layers and seeing how science and public opinion and, political identity, how they all kind of intersect and influence each other. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Okay, so before we go full-on deep dive mode, let's just make sure we're all on the same page here. What exactly are we talking about when we say solar geoengineering?
Right.
Some people might also hear it called solar radiation management or SRM, but, what is it in a nutshell?
Okay, so in the simplest terms, it's basically a bunch of technologies that aim to, cool down the planet, right? And they do this by either reflecting more sunlight back into space so it doesn't even reach us, or by kind of messing with the atmosphere to reduce the amount of heat that gets trapped here.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. So what are some real-world examples of how this solar geoengineering would actually work?
All right, so one idea that gets thrown around a lot is injecting these teeny tiny reflective particles into the upper atmosphere. It's almost like, mimicking what happens after a huge volcanic eruption when all that dust and ash gets spewed up there.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Another approach is trying to make low-lying clouds more reflective. And then there's also this idea of thinning out high-altitude clouds, which tend to trap heat.
It all sounds a bit, like science fiction-y. But I guess if the National Academies of Sciences is recommending we put some money into researching it alongside all the stuff about reducing emissions, then it must be something worth taking seriously, right?
Yeah, exactly. That recommendation back in 2021 really kind of shows you how people are thinking about it. It's like, okay, this could be a valuable tool, but we really need to understand it better. And that's where this research comes in because, to be honest, public opinion on solar geoengineering is still pretty, I guess you could say, all over the place.
And that's especially true in the U.S., right? I mean, come on, climate change is such a politically charged issue here. It's like everyone's got their own entrenched opinions, and it's hard to have a real conversation sometimes.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's precisely why this research is so interesting. It dives right into that messiness. It looks at how different ways of talking about solar geoengineering, whether it's like a partner to emissions reductions or maybe even a replacement for them, or if it could actually be a bad thing, like a moral hazard, because it makes people think they don't have to worry about emissions anymore. It looks at how all those different spins on the story, how they play out depending on who's doing the talking.
Okay, that makes sense. So how did the researchers actually go about figuring this all out? What was their game plan?
So they did this really cool thing called a conjoint experiment. Think of it like a super fancy survey, but with a lot more depth. They had 2,023 registered American voters, and they presented them with all these different made-up scenarios about solar geoengineering.
Okay.
And these scenarios were tweaked very carefully. They changed a few key things.
Oh, okay.
First, they changed how solar geoengineering was described. Was it a complement to emissions reductions, a substitute, or a moral hazard? Then they changed who was supposedly saying these things. Was it someone who seemed like a Democrat or a Republican? And lastly, they even played around with the person's job. Were they a researcher or a podcaster?
Wow. So they were really trying to get at how we consume information in the real world, right?
Okay.
It's not just the message itself, but it's also about who's saying it and what their whole deal is.
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to figure out what mattered most, the message itself, the political leanings of the messenger, or even their job title.
Okay, so after all that, what did they find? What were the biggest takeaways?
Well, the most striking thing, and this is kind of obvious from the title of the paper, is that which political party the messenger seemed to belong to, that was the biggest factor by far. It was way more important than anything else they tried.
Okay, hold on. Let's break that down a bit. What does biggest factor actually mean in this case?
It means that whether someone was a Democrat or a Republican, that pretty much determined whether they'd trust the messenger and support solar geoengineering just based on whether that messenger seemed like they were on the same political team. The actual arguments about solar geoengineering, they didn't matter nearly as much as who was making them.
I mean, yeah, that's not super surprising given how divided things are these days. But let's get specific. How big of an impact are we talking about here?
So for Republicans, if the source seemed like a fellow Republican, their trust went up a whopping 34% compared to when the source seemed like a Democrat. On a scale of 0 to 10, their trust went from like 3 points to over 4.
Wow, that's a pretty big jump. And what about their actual support for using solar geoengineering? Did that change too?
Yeah, it did, but not quite as much. Their support went up by about 10% when they thought the source was a Republican, going from an average of like 3.48 to 3.85 on that same 0 to 10 scale.
Okay, so basically, if a Republican-leaning person talks about solar geoengineering, other Republicans are more likely to trust them and be okay with the whole idea.
Sure.
What about Democrats? Did they show the same kind of pattern?
Yeah, pretty much. When the source seemed like a Democrat, their trust went up by about 28% compared to a Republican source. Their trust score went from around 4.5 to almost 5.8.
Another big increase. And what about their support for actually using solar geoengineering?
Their support went up too by about 7%, going from like 5.5 to a little under 6.
So it seems like no matter who you are, Democrat or Republican,
Yeah.
you're way more likely to be swayed by someone you see as being on your side. The messenger really does matter.
Exactly. That's the big takeaway here. And it's interesting because it means that all those different ways of framing solar geoengineering, all those different arguments, they actually had a pretty small impact compared to just knowing which political party the messenger seemed to belong to.
Right, right. Whether it was presented as a way to help with emissions reductions or a replacement for them or even something that could make things worse, it just didn't matter as much as who was saying it.
Exactly.
So let's talk about those different frames for a second. Just to recap, we have the complement frame, where solar geoengineering is presented as working alongside emissions reductions. Then there's the substitute frame, where it's presented as a potential alternative to those reductions. And lastly, there's the moral hazard frame, where people might get complacent about emissions because they think solar geoengineering will fix everything.
Exactly. Those were the three main narratives they tested.
And you'd think that those different frames would resonate differently with different groups, right? Like maybe people who are skeptical of government regulation would be more drawn to the substitute frame, thinking we can just tech our way out of this problem.
Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But the funny thing is, it didn't really pan out that way. Those different frames, they had surprisingly little impact on people's trust in the messenger or their overall support for solar geoengineering, especially compared to the huge impact of just knowing the messenger's supposed political leanings.
So it's almost like the actual content of the message was secondary. As long as the person delivering it seemed like they were on the same team, people were more inclined to go along with it.
Pretty much, yeah. There was one little exception, though. Democrats tended to trust the messenger a bit less when solar geoengineering was presented as a substitute for emissions reductions compared to the other two frames.
Okay, that kind of makes sense. Democrats are generally more concerned about climate change, so maybe they're a bit wary of any solution that seems like it's letting us off the hook for reducing emissions.
Yeah, that's a plausible explanation. So yeah, framing wasn't completely irrelevant, but it was definitely a much smaller factor than the partisan identity of the messenger.
Okay, so we've talked about the message itself and the messenger's political leanings. What about their job title? Did it matter if they were presented as a researcher or a podcaster?
That's a good question, and that was actually the third big finding from the study, and the short answer is not really. At least not for Republicans. They didn't seem to care whether the information came from a researcher or a podcaster. Their trust and support for solar geoengineering stayed pretty much the same.
That's interesting. You'd think a researcher would have more credibility, right? Being a scientist and all.
You'd think so, but again, it seems like the partisan factor was so strong that it just overshadowed everything else. For Democrats, there was a slight difference. They did trust researchers a bit more than podcasters, but here's the kicker. Even though they trusted researchers more, it didn't actually change their support for solar geoengineering.
So, once again, it's all about the messenger. Even if the messenger seems more credible, it doesn't necessarily translate into a change in people's core beliefs about whether or not solar geoengineering is a good idea.
Exactly.
Okay, so the fourth big finding from the study was about people's broader policy preferences. Like, what do they think the U.S. should actually do about climate change? Should we invest in reducing emissions, invest in solar geoengineering, do both, or do neither?
Right. And what they found here is that people's existing beliefs about climate change, their ideology, it really played a huge role in shaping their policy preferences.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So no matter how solar geoengineering was presented or who was presenting it, the most common preference among Republicans was to do neither. They didn't want to do solar geoengineering, and they didn't want to do significant emissions reductions either.
Okay.
And this kind of tracks with what we know about Republican views on climate change, right? There's a significant portion of the Republican base that's skeptical of climate science and doesn't see the need for drastic action.
It really shows how hard it is to change people's minds, especially when it comes to something as politically charged as climate change. What about Democrats? What were their preferences?
Democrats were a bit more open to different options, but their general preference was to do both. They wanted to invest in solar geoengineering research, but they also wanted to make serious cuts to emissions. And this preference held pretty steady even when the messenger was a Republican.
So even though the messenger's political leanings could influence their trust and their feelings about solar geoengineering specifically, it didn't really change their overall stance on what the U.S. should do about climate change.
Exactly.
Okay, there's one more thing I want to talk about. The study also looked at the impact of introducing the concept of termination shock.
Yeah, that's a crucial one.
For those who don't know, what is termination shock, and how did it factor into people's perceptions?
So termination shock is basically the scary scenario where we've been using solar geoengineering to keep the planet cool, but then we suddenly stop, and all the heat that we've been masking with this technology, it comes rushing back, and temperatures spike really rapidly.
Oh, wow. So like we're kicking the can down the road, and then the can explodes.
Kind of, yeah. Solar geoengineering can temporarily hide the warming caused by all the CO2 we're pumping into the atmosphere, but it doesn't actually remove the CO2. So if we stop doing it, all that warming catches up with us.
Okay, that's pretty terrifying. So how did learning about this termination shock thing affect people's views on solar geoengineering?
Well, for Republicans, it definitely made them more wary. Their trust in the messenger went down, and their support for solar geoengineering went down too, especially when it was presented as a substitute for emissions reductions.
So maybe they were starting to realize that solar geoengineering isn't a simple fix. It's not something you can just turn on and forget about.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. For Democrats, the impact was smaller. Their trust and support levels didn't really change that much.
So it seems like termination shock was a bigger deal for Republicans than for Democrats. But here's the million-dollar question. Did learning about this risk actually change anyone's fundamental beliefs about what the U.S. should do about climate change?
Nope, not really. Republicans still mostly preferred to do nothing, and Democrats still mostly preferred to do both emissions reductions and solar geoengineering research.
Wow. So even when faced with a potentially catastrophic risk, people's core beliefs stayed pretty much the same. That's, I don't know, kind of disheartening.
It is. But it also underscores how deeply ingrained these beliefs are.
Okay, so if we take a step back and look at all of this research, what's the big takeaway for us? What does it tell us about how people are thinking about solar geoengineering?
I think the main message is pretty clear. In a country as divided as the U.S., the most important thing isn't the message itself, it's the messenger. People are much more likely to be swayed by someone they see as being on their own political team, regardless of what that person is actually saying.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it also makes me wonder, if everything is so filtered through this lens of political identity, how can we even have a productive conversation about something as complex and important as solar geoengineering?
That's the challenge, isn't it? And it's not just about solar geoengineering. This is a problem for any issue that gets caught up in the political crossfire.
Absolutely. So, to our listeners out there, I'm curious, what do you think? How can we break through these political barriers and have real, honest conversations about climate change and all the potential solutions, including things like solar geoengineering? Is it even possible?
And maybe even more importantly, how much are we letting our own political biases influence how we think about these issues?
So much to think about. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.